In this series, we've learned about the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the nearly 100 years of potential peace plans for the region. Some of those have succeeded, like between Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt, but many others have failed, namely between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So what makes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seem so insurmountable? With all the failed efforts so far, is there any hope for peace? And how do the peace plans currently being discussed address some of the stickiest issues? When you boil it down, there have always been 4 or 5 core issues under discussion. Originally, the disagreement revolved around borders, security, Jerusalem, and refugees. After the Six-Day War, though, when Israelis started to live in the West Bank, the issue of Israeli settlements was added to the list. If you've watched the previous episodes in this series, and if you haven't, you should, you know that while the Jews accepted the Peel Commission plan, the Arabs rejected it. At this time, there weren't refugees yet, but the plan would have created the equivalent of refugees by moving people around so they were living in their respective country. The UN partition plan failed, but it did result in what Israel calls the War of Independence and Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe. The war resulted in massive land gains for the Jews and around 700,000 Palestinian Arab refugees who fled to Arab states. Unrest in Arab countries created around 800,000 Jewish refugees who fled to Israel, while Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank became Jordanian citizens and Gazans lived under Egyptian rule. 19 years later, the Six-Day War, or June War, again resulted in massive land gains for Israel. Immediately after the Six-Day War, Israel said they'd trade land they had conquered for a lasting peace with Arab states. This offer was cemented into international law with the passing of UN Resolution 242, the UN's next attempt at, quote, the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. One caveat though, there's disagreement over whether 242 calls on Israel to withdraw from all the land it conquered or just some of it. Either way, Israel's offer was especially bold considering that 3 months earlier, the Arab League had come together and signed the Khartoum Resolution, famous for its 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. In 1973, Egypt invaded, sparking what's known as the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War. 5.5 years later, the Egyptians signed a peace agreement with Israel, which included giving back land and establishing recognized borders, uprooting Israeli settlements, Egyptian recognition of the Jewish state, and agreements on security measures. In 1994, Jordan signed its own treaty with Israel, which included agreements on borders, security, Jerusalem, and refugees. Around that same time, there was the Oslo peace process. Here, for the first time, the Palestinians get their name up on the chart. The Oslo Accords were ratified in 2 separate agreements in 1993 and 95, and were mostly an agreement to agree on things in the future. Right off the bat, they tabled discussions on final borders, Jerusalem, and refugees until they reached a final agreement. Borders were obviously tricky since they'd been arguing over those for more than 50 years. Jerusalem was especially problematic because while Palestinians wanted East Jerusalem as their capital city, most Israelis did not want to redivide the city. Refugees were complicated because Israel absorbed the 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries and felt that Arab states should absorb the Palestinian refugees. The Palestinians agreed to recognize the state of Israel, and Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, as the representative of the Palestinian people, but Israel didn't recognize the Palestinian state as one didn't exist. On the security front, the PLO agreed to renounce terror, and Israel agreed to withdraw from certain areas, creating 3 types of areas. Area A, under full Palestinian control, Area B, under full Palestinian civil control and joint Israeli-Palestinian security control, and Area C, which included Israeli settlements, under full Israeli civil and security control. Ongoing Palestinian terrorism created a massive debate among Israelis over continuing negotiations and concessions, especially giving the Palestinians increased autonomy and land that could potentially enable further terror. Meanwhile, continued settlement expansion, while never part of the agreements, left Palestinians feeling that Israel wasn't serious about negotiating. In July 2000, US President Bill Clinton and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak drafted a final agreement that they presented to Palestinian President Yasser Arafat that finally addressed all the issues, giving the Palestinians all of Gaza and 90% of the West Bank, parts of East Jerusalem, monetary compensation to Palestinian refugees, and the uprooting of Israeli settlements, except for the largest ones, which would remain Israeli territory, sort of like peninsulas stretching into the West Bank. But the Palestinians rejected the offer and made no counteroffer. Then, in 2008, Israel made an unprecedented offer. Using the idea of land swaps, they offered the equivalent of 99% of the West Bank and Gaza East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital with the old city of Jerusalem under international control, monetary compensation for refugees, and a symbolic number of refugees allowed to return to Israel, and the destruction of Israeli settlements except for the largest ones. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas rejected the offer. In an interview with chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat, he quoted Abbas as saying, "Abu Mazen too answered with defiance, saying, 'I am not in a marketplace or a bazaar. I came to demarcate the borders of Palestine, the June 4th, 1967 borders, without detracting a single inch and without detracting a single stone from Jerusalem or from the holy Christian and Muslim places.' This is why the Palestinian negotiators did not sign." This was essentially the end of official negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. With the end of the peace process, Israel, the Palestinians, and the international community have, for the most part, turned to managing the conflict rather than seeking a solution. But that doesn't mean there aren't plans being discussed, so let's get an understanding of what's out there. One idea floated to varying degrees of outrage is the one-state solution, wherein everyone who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea would become citizens of a binational democratic state. Michael Tarazi, a Palestinian-American lawyer and former advisor to the PLO, wrote in the New York Times that the one-state solution is simply the recognition of the uncomfortable reality that Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories already function as a single state. While many Israelis argue that the demographic changes would lead to a Jewish minority and the end of a Jewish state as we know it, there are Jewish Israelis who support the one-state solution. Some left-wing Israelis argue that there is no longer a need for a Jewish state, while some right-wing Israelis who support the plan say that there is no risk to the Jewish nature of the state, arguing that Palestinian population numbers are inflated. So while there are both Israelis and Palestinians who support the one-state solution, which solves the issues of Jerusalem, settlements, and theoretically security, they still disagree on some of the thorniest issues. Most importantly, the existence of a Jewish state. They also disagree about what to do with the 5 million Palestinian refugees living in other countries, and whether or not to include Gaza in this one state, since Gaza is currently a hotbed of terrorism led by Hamas, who can't even form a unified government with the West Bank Palestinians, much less a unified government with the Jewish state. There are many in Israel that argue against pursuing more negotiations. They point to the history of failed negotiations, the seemingly unsolvable issues, and the pattern of negotiations actually increasing terror attacks as part of terrorist groups' efforts to sabotage those negotiations. Instead, many Israelis support managing the conflict through a combination of unilateral moves and improving life for Palestinians. Now, this isn't about a utopian peaceful end to the conflict, but rather a way to give Palestinians more control while still ensuring Israel's security and Jewish democratic character. Of course, the solutions I've mentioned aren't the only ones out there, with my personal favorite being the Onion's 317 million state solution that grants an independent state to each and every person living in the entire Middle East. While obviously a joke, I think the plan speaks to the reality that coming up with a solution to this problem is really hard, and everyone has their own opinion about it. Or, as H.L. Mencken wrote in 1920, there is always a well-known solution to every human problem: neat, plausible, and wrong. So, while we may not have solved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here, we hope you have a better understanding of this complex issue. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week.